Okay, hi guys, this is part 2 of chapter 8. We left off by finishing up with John Watson. We're going to go into some of the neo-behaviorists now. A couple of names that you may not have heard of. The first person I'm going to talk about is a man named Edward Tolman. And Tolman, lineage-wise, studied with Münsterberg at Harvard, as well as with a man named Robert Yerkes. Yerkes is one of the kind of great early primate behaviorists in the history of not only kind of primate research, but kind of broadly psychology. And Tolman studied with both of those people, so that's when he was at Harvard, because they were both at Harvard. Tolman wrote a book called Purposive Behavior in Animals and Men, which was an important book. The idea was that he put forth is that behavior, animal behavior, but behavior is directed toward some goal. And while that seems like it's a fairly straightforward idea for us, in many ways people often attributed animal behavior to instincts, not necessarily towards goals. In other words, they were very often driven towards things, and that included us as human beings, as an outgrowth of some of the psychoanalytic work. But it also leads to some issues that Tolman brings up that in many ways created some problems for him in the behavioral realm, but also opened up the door for some other kind of ideologies to kind of flourish. And that was the idea that essentially behaviors involve cognitions. Tolman argued on this point very often with his contemporaries. And this got him in a lot of hot water in many ways. He felt that the cognitions were the piece that engendered the purposiveness, or what we'd call purposefulness, of behaviors. In other words, cognitions gave us the reason for actually doing the behaviors, that we had some sort of reason, some sort of goal, some sort of outcome that we wanted. And that wasn't just us as humans, that included animals. This brought him in disagreement with a man named Clark Hull, who we'll talk about in a few moments. Hull was another kind of behaviorist, and so Tolman and Hull were at odds about this issue regarding cognition, as many behaviorists were at odds with Tolman about. Tolman actually talked about the idea of cognitive maps, and that was essentially how we develop experience, by developing these cognitive maps and being able to recall them later. Now, for Tolman, maps weren't maps as we think about them generally, where there's a schematic of, pictures about where we go, what we do. A cognitive map was more of a it was kind of a prototype of a schema. It was more of a set sense of actions to engage in order to have a certain outcome. But nonetheless, this was a fairly heavy focus on cognition in the behavioral realm, which caused him a little bit of consternation with some of his colleagues. Tolman was also a person that called for what he referred to as intervening variables in between the stimulus and the response in classical conditioning. Now, normally in class, this is where I would say, who does this remind you of, or who do we talk about in the past who did this? But since we can't really do that, this is very similar in many ways to what Robert Woodworth did, many years before, when he called for instead of the SR paradigm, and I remember writing this on the board, and we've talked about this, I think it was a question on your second exam actually, that the intervening variable that Woodworth talked about was the O, or the organism, that there's a stimulus, the organism recognizes the stimulus in some way, and then there's a response. And so Tolman talked about actually more kind of possible options as intervening variables, one of which were cognitions. And the cognition piece is what often allows us to make distinctions or determinations about certain stimuli, and that may very well reflect upon the nature of the behavior that we engage in. I think I've used this in class as an example before, but if somebody's running at you, well, the fact that someone's running at you could engender any host of responses. It depends on our perception of the person that's running at you. So if the person who's running at you is somebody that you know versus somebody that you don't know, well, that perception might change your response. Just like if somebody's running at you with a weapon and seems very angry versus somebody's running at you with I don't know, a wrapped gift, and they're smiling, and they seem very happy. Those are very different contexts of the stimuli, and so that for Tolman, the cognition or the interpretation of the stimulus often leads to the response. It's not necessarily the stimulus in and of itself. Again, this got him into some hot water because it involved the concept of cognitions at a pretty heavy level. Tolman also made a distinction between learning and performance. He said learning cannot be directly observed. That was an internal kind of process. But performance could. Now, this is where some of the behavioral stuff often gets into sticky water with non-behaviorists. And that is the idea that, well, if what we're talking about is learning, but what we're measuring is performance, and you're making the distinction between the two, what you're really doing is you're measuring performance, not necessarily learning. In other words, people or animals could do certain things, not necessarily by learning, but just by haphazard random chance. Now, behavioral arguments, which I think are pretty reasonable, is that that may be true initially, but over time, what we find is that is learning, that in a certain context, a certain behavior is selected. But it underlies the idea that behaviorists often talk about railing against psychoanalytic approaches and other approaches, including cognitive approaches very often, that have to do with underlying unobservable phenomena that are difficult to measure. You can only measure correlates of it. In the same way that we don't really measure sadness, other than if somebody cries, and we can attribute it to them being sad, because crying could happen for any host of reasons. So crying doesn't equal sadness. Crying is a particular behavior in which we engage, which is often related to sadness, but people can cry for any host of reasons. And so so the underlying idea of sadness is difficult to measure, the same way that the underlying idea of certain thoughts, or from Tolman's perspective, learning might be difficult to measure. As I mentioned before, Tolman had some disagreements with Hull as well as with Skinner when Skinner really started to come into his own as far as his career. And that caused him some difficulty career-wise. Tolman also talked about something called latent learning. And in other words, what he was saying here is that animals don't have to necessarily have direct reinforcement in order to learn. And he showed this by putting rats in mazes and found that the rats will learn in mazes even if they're not given any direct reinforcement after the maze is completed. Now, other behaviorists often argue that there are sources of reinforcement that are being engaged. So, for example, boredom, lack of interest, stimulation, some sort of reduction in an aversive, even if it's a mildly aversive state of being in the maze versus being out of the maze. But you didn't have to actually give the rat usually a food item or something that's preferred like that after in order for them to learn how to get out of a maze. Tolman was actually able to find this out through his research. You don't have this because of all the problems with the textbook issue through the bookstore early in the semester, but your book kind of indicates that Tolman, quote, lost the war with Skinner and Hull. I'm not sure if I actually agree with that. His name is certainly not nearly as well remembered as Skinner's, but very few psychologists' names are. And in many ways, his importance in the behavioral realm was kind of downplayed by Skinner and Hull and some of his contemporaries. But Tolman's work really set the stage for the cognitive revolution because of his the preeminence he placed on cognition or thoughts. In many ways, it was influential for people like Walter Mischel, who we haven't talked much about, we haven't talked about at all, as well as Albert Bandura, who's very well known for social learning theory and vicarious learning and observational learning. It's pretty clear that that Bandura was influenced by Tolman's work early on. And so while Tolman's name may be to some extent lost to history or downplayed in history, his impact is very important. I think in some ways, I don't put him at quite the same level as someone like Helmholtz, but a person his individual work may not be remembered, but what his work set the conditions for has some long-standing important impact. So. And then there's a slide with some pictures. What you actually have is Tolman is to the left on that slide, Hull is to the right, and in the middle there's a picture of three people. From right to left of that picture is Hull, Tolman, and then the person on the left-hand side is a man named Kurt Lewin, who we'll talk about in Chapter 10. Lewin's probably one of the most impressive people in the history of psychology as far as I'm concerned, but we'll get to him later. On to another neo-behaviorist that I briefly mentioned before, Clark Hull. A little bit about a background on Hull. He got his PhD under a psychologist by the name of Jastrow when he was at University of Wisconsin. Jastrow was a very important early psychologist, and Hull kind of came out of the Jastrow line. Jastrow was influenced by a number of people, including Titchener early on, but we don't have to worry about that. Hull spent essentially his entire career at Yale, which is a pretty good gig if you can get it, generally speaking. And he was very well published, very well renowned from kind of the late 20s, really throughout the 30s and into the 40s. So Hull was a big player in that second tier of kind of important psychologists in America. Not the Cattell, Hall kind of crew, but that next kind of realm or grouping. He published a book called Principles of Behavior, which was a very important book in the 40s that became kind of a standard for behavioral psychology for many years. Clark developed what he called the hypothetico-deductive method, which sounds pretty impressive. In essence, this really breaks down to three pieces. The first of these three pieces for the hypothetical deductive model is to identify postulates. In other words, identify underlying tenets or core statements about your research, the things that are either well accepted or kind of general rules that apply to the research that you're doing. The second was develop hypotheses. So develop hypotheses based on these postulates, okay, coming up with ideas. And then the third is test these hypotheses. Okay? If the hypotheses are confirmed, then it supports the postulate. If the hypotheses aren't confirmed, you need to either go back and review the postulate, and you may have to modify it, or you need to review your methodology for the experiment to make sure that it was solid. Again, this is not exactly earth-shattering stuff for us now, but at the time, the idea of identifying the postulates, developing the hypotheses, and testing the hypotheses was kind of set early groundwork. In many ways, to me, it's even a little bit less well delineated than kind of the Wundtian and Titchenerian kind of pieces. But Hull became fairly well known for this hypothetico-deductive model. You can put a line through reinforcement and drive reduction. We don't need to kind of get into that. Hull's legacy, again, at the time he was very well respected and very well published, kind of quote-unquote won the war against Tolman at the time. But Hull's name is in many ways downplayed in the history of psychology as well. And I think that's because life was not nearly as systematic or as lawful as he postulated that it was. And there's another piece that I need to read for you regarding Hull from the book. And so I'm going to read this out just to kind of give you the context of it. here's how Hull conceptualized his theory, and this goes back to the Principles of Behavior text that he wrote in the 40s. I came to the definite conclusion around 1930 that psychology is a true natural science, that its primary laws are expressible quantitatively by means of a moderate number of ordinary equations, that all the complex behavior of single individuals will ultimately be derivable as secondary laws from 1, these primary laws, together with 2, the conditions under which the behavior occurs, and that all the behavior of groups as a whole, i.e. strictly social behavior as such, may similarly be derived as quantitative laws from the same primary equations. Okay? That kind of folded into that hypothetico-deductive model that he posited, but it requires a heavy faith and belief in the lawfulness of human behavior, and in many ways human behavior has not been shown or was not borne out as being quite as lawful and as quantifiable as he put forth. And so Hull's influence at the time was quite important, but not particularly so long term.